If Shackleton had known what waited for him in the Weddell Sea, he might never have set sail. But he did not know, and so he pressed on. He stood at his desk in a cramped office in London, holding a folded advertisement he had placed in the Times. The words were his own. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition in case of success. He read the lines again, feeling the weight of them. Then he set the paper down, tucked it into a drawer, and walked out into the grey street. 5,000 men answered that call. He chose 27. Now he stood on the deck of the Endurance, the wind biting at his cheeks. The harbour at South Georgia was quiet on the morning of December 5th, 1914. He looked back at the whaling station, its chimneys puffing smoke against the snow-dusted mountains. Captain Worsley checked his sextant on the bridge. Below, the crew stowed the last of the supplies. Shackleton gave the order. The anchor chain rattled up through the hawse hole. The ship turned south. He did not look back again. He gripped the railing and watched the open water ahead. If he had known what the ice would do to his ship, would he still have gone? He would not answer that question. He only knew that the adventure called, and he had answered. The Endurance was a beauty. A 3-masted barkentine built of Norwegian fir and oak, she had a hull reinforced for ice, thick enough to withstand most frozen seas. Shackleton stood in the waist of the ship, running his hand along the rail. Below his feet, the crew worked in the forecastle, checking stores, tightening ropes, sharing jokes. They were 27 men total, including Captain Frank Worsley, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and the carpenter, Harry McNeish, whose hands could mend anything. In early December, the ship pushed into the Weddell Sea. The water turned from deep blue to a pale, milky grey. The first chunks of pack ice appeared on December 7th. Shackleton peered through his binoculars from the bridge. Worsley stood beside him, one hand on the wheel. The ice grew thicker day by day, a white mosaic that cracked and groaned around the hull. By January 18, 1915, the Endurance had made good progress, but on the morning of January 19th, the ice closed in like a vice. Worsley checked the log. They were stuck. Shackleton stood at the bow, staring at the endless white plain ahead. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to the crew and ordered them to set up a routine. They would overwinter here. They would drift with the ice. It was not a disaster. It was simply a change of plans. The men nodded. They set to work. Months passed. The sun disappeared in May and did not return until August. Shackleton spent those dark months in his cabin, reading, writing, and pacing. He listened every night to the ice. It did not stop talking. Pressure ridges rose around the ship like frozen mountains. The timbers groaned. The deck warped. The hull began to twist. On October 24, 1915, a new wave of pressure hit. Shackleton stood on the deck, boots planted wide, watching the ice crush against the starboard side. The Endurance shuddered. Planks splintered. Below, water seeped into the hold. The pumps ran constantly, but they could not keep up. Worsley marked the angle of the ship. She was listing to port, listing hard. On the morning of October 27th, Shackleton walked to the mast. The ice had punched a hole in the hull as big as a man's torso. Water poured in. The ship groaned again, a sound like a wounded animal. Shackleton turned to Worsley. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "She's going!" The crew did not hesitate. They scrambled. They hauled sledges, lifeboats, tents, and provisions over the side. McNeish swung his hammer, releasing the last of the timbers. Shackleton grabbed the ship's flag, folded it, and tucked it under his arm. He stepped off the deck onto the ice, felt the cold, solid surface beneath his boots. Behind him, the Endurance settled into the ice, groaning her last. The ice stretched flat and white in every direction. Shackleton chose a spot a mile from the wreck. The men drove stakes into the frozen surface. They raised tents, 3 men to a tent, the canvas flapping in the wind. The dogs curled in the snow, tails tucked. The crates of rations formed a low wall. Canned meat, biscuits, dried milk, and a stack of seal blubber for fuel. The stores were meagre, enough for weeks, maybe months. Shackleton walked the camp each morning. He checked the tents, the dogs, the state of the ice. He spoke to every man by name. At night he gathered them around the primus stove. He talked of the march ahead, the lifeboats, the whaling stations. He kept their eyes fixed on the horizon. On November 21st, 1915, a lookout shouted. The men turned. The Endurance's stern rose slowly, a dark shape against the grey sky. The ice held her for a moment. Then she slid under. The sea closed over her masts. Shackleton stood at the edge of the floe. He did not speak. The crew watched in silence. A dog whined. The ice cracked nearby. Shackleton turned back to camp. He clapped his hands. "Routine," he said. "We hold to routine." The men moved. They checked the sledges. They fed the dogs. They kept the hope alive. December 23rd, 1915. Shackleton gave the order. The men lashed the 3 lifeboats onto heavy sledges. They harnessed themselves to the ropes. The dogs barked and pulled. The ice was rough, broken into jagged pressure ridges. Every step was a struggle. They hauled for hours. The sledges tipped. The boats slid sideways. The men cursed and heaved. By dusk, they had moved less than 2 miles. Shackleton wiped ice from his beard. He looked at the white expanse ahead. The next day, they tried again. The same slow crawl. 1 step, rest, haul again. On the 3rd day, a lead of open water opened to the south. They launched the boats and rowed for a few hours. Then the lead closed. They dragged the boats back onto the ice. Progress was a joke. A few miles in a week. The cold ate at their fingers. The rations shrank. Shackleton called a halt. He sat on a coil of rope and studied the map. Worsley stood beside him. Shackleton shook his head. "We cannot outwalk this ice," he said. He folded the map. "We let the drift carry us. We wait for the spring thaw." The men made camp. They built another wall of snow blocks. They settled in for the long wait. The ice groaned beneath them, moving them eastward, inch by inch. Spring came slowly. The ice groaned and cracked. Leads of dark water opened between the floes. On April 9, 1916, Shackleton gave the signal. The men launched the 3 boats, the Dudley Docker, the Stancomb Wills, the James Caird. They rowed through the narrow channels. Ice scraped the hulls. The men pulled hard. The boats rose and fell on the swell. For 7 days they navigated the open leads, landing on floes to rest and eat. The cold bit deep. On April 15th, a lookout spotted land. A dark rock rising from the sea. Elephant Island. The men cheered. They rowed toward it. The shore was steep, covered in scree and penguin guano. The surf crashed against the rocks. Shackleton found a narrow beach. He guided the boats in one by one. The men jumped onto the shingle. They stood on solid ground for the first time in over a year. They gathered driftwood. They built a crude shelter from the boat covers and stones. They killed penguins for meat. The wind howled. The beach was bleak, constantly lashed by spray. Shackleton climbed a ridge and scanned the empty ocean. No ships, no smoke. He knew this island was far from any shipping lane. No one would find them here. Rescue would have to go by sea. He turned back to camp. He began to plan the next voyage. Shackleton gathered the men on the shingle beach. He studied each face. He knew the journey ahead would test them beyond reason. He chose Worsley for his navigation. He chose Crean for his endurance. He chose McCarthy for his seamanship. He chose Vincent for his strength, and McNish for his carpenter skills. McNish had argued with Shackleton before, but Shackleton needed his stubbornness now. McNish worked on the James Caird. He raised the gunwales. He reinforced the keel. He rigged a makeshift deck using canvas and wood scraps. The other men loaded provisions: 2 weeks of food, a Primus stove, a sextant, a compass, a chronometer, 6 sleeping bags, water casks. They stowed it all carefully. Every ounce mattered. April 24th, 1916. The wind shifted to the southwest. The sea calmed. Shackleton gave the order. The men launched the boat. They pulled through the surf. The waves caught them. The boat rose. It fell. Spray soaked them instantly. The beach grew small behind them. Elephant Island became a dark line on the horizon. The 6 men were alone on the Southern Ocean. The James Caird was 22 feet long. The journey was 800 miles. The men did not look back. The Southern Ocean did not let them rest. Gales struck the James Caird every day. Waves towered above the mast. The men huddled in the cramped space. Water poured over the sides. They bailed constantly. The canvas deck held, but only just. Spray turned to ice on the rigging. The cold bit into their hands and feet. McNish worked the pump. Vincent grew weak. Crean kept the others moving. Worsley took sextant readings between swells. He braced himself on the gunwale. The sun appeared for moments. He snatched its angle. He calculated their position. The boat rose and fell. The numbers blurred. They missed South Georgia. They sailed past it in the fog. Shackleton saw the frustration in Worsley's eyes. He said nothing. They kept going. Day after day. The food ran low. The water turned brackish. The stove failed. They chewed raw seal meat. The men grew thin. Faces grey. Eyes hollow. Then, on May 8th, 1916, a break in the clouds. Worsley saw cliffs. Land. South Georgia. The men shouted, but the wind turned. A hurricane rose from the south. The waves crashed against the shore. They could not land. They waited offshore for 2 days. The boat pitched. The men prayed. Shackleton held the tiller. His eyes stayed on the cliffs. May 10th, 1916. The wind finally dropped. Shackleton guided the James Caird through a narrow gap in the rocks. They beached at King Haakon Bay. The men stumbled onto the shore. Their legs shook. Their hands were numb. They found a cave. They built a fire. They cooked penguin meat. They rested. But they were on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station at Stromness lay on the other side, over the mountains. Uncharted mountains. No maps, no climbing gear. Shackleton looked at the peaks. He looked at his men. Vincent and McCarthy were too weak. McNish had injured his back. Shackleton decided. He would take Worsley and Crean. They would cross the interior. They started at 3 in the morning. They climbed in darkness. They scrambled over ice. They slid down slopes. They had a compass and a length of rope. No crampons, no ice axes. They moved for 37 hours without sleep. They crossed snowfields. They descended cliffs. They reached a final ridge. They heard a sound, a steam whistle. The whaling station. Stromness. May 20th, 1916. They stumbled into the settlement. The whalers stared. Ragged men, frostbitten, alive. Shackleton asked for help for his men on Elephant Island. The whalers gave it. The crossing was over. The gamble had paid off. Shackleton did not rest. He borrowed ships. He tried to go back immediately. The first rescue attempt left South Georgia on May 23rd. The ice blocked them. They turned back. He tried again in June. Another ship. More ice. The southern sky could not break through. He tried a third time. The Uruguayan government loaned him a trawler, the Instituto de Pesca. Again, the ice won. The men on Elephant Island waited. They had no idea if rescue would come. They lived under the overturned lifeboats. They ate seals and penguins. They watched the horizon. Every day, every hour. Shackleton arrived in Punta Arenas, Chile. He begged for a small tug, the Yelcho. It had no reinforced hull, but the ice had loosened. He sailed on August 25th. Worsley navigated again. They pushed through loose pack ice. On August 30th, they reached Elephant Island. Shackleton stood on the bow. He counted the men on the beach. 1, 2, 3. He counted all 22. They were thin. They were bearded. They were alive. They waved. They cheered. The castaways ran to the water's edge. Shackleton stepped ashore. He looked at each man. He said quietly, "All safe." The rescue took every last man. No one was left behind. If Shackleton had known the outcome, he would have sailed anyway. Not because he knew they would survive, but because survival depends on daring. The ice could have crushed them. The sea could have swallowed them. The mountains could have stopped them. But he refused to give up. He gambled everything. And the gamble paid off. Every single man came home.